She had not expected him to be standing in the yard when she arrived. Most men, when caught off guard, either moved toward the disruption or away from it. Boone Calloway did neither. He stood exactly where he was in the middle of the yard between the barn and the well, holding a length of fence wire in one hand and a pair of pliers in the other, and he looked at her the way a man looks at weather coming in from a direction he hadn't checked that morning. Not angry, not welcoming, just very, very still. Wren Adler set her bag down on the ground beside the wagon that had brought her the last 6 miles from the relay station. The driver, a weathered man of few words, who had been even fewer of them during the ride, handed down her second bag without comment and clicked his horse forward before she had fully steadied herself. The dust of his leaving settled slow and golden in the late afternoon light. She looked at the man in the yard. He looked at her. The ranch behind him was called Greystone, and it was neither grand nor broken down. It was the kind of place that had been built by someone who cared more about whether a thing would last than whether it would impress, and it had lasted. The main house was solid timber with a covered porch running the length of the front, the wood weathered to a soft gray that matched the name. Beyond it, a barn, a stable, 2 outbuildings, a kitchen garden that had gone a little wild at the edges but not been abandoned. The land rolled away in every direction into grass and sky, the kind of landscape that either made a person feel free or very small, depending on what they had left behind them. Wren had left behind enough that the sky felt generous. A woman appeared in the doorway of the house before either of them spoke. She was older, round-faced, with the particular stillness of someone who has just realized that a situation she had carefully arranged was now unfolding in front of her, whether she was ready for it or not. She wiped her hands on her apron once. Then again, the man in the yard looked at the woman in the doorway. Something passed between them that did not require words because it had clearly been building toward words for some time and had simply run out of patience with them. "Ida," he said. One word, the kind that contained several others. "I can explain," the woman said. "I expect you can." He set the fence wire and the pliers down on the top rail of the nearest post with a deliberateness that was almost careful. Then he walked toward the house, and as he passed Wren, he paused, not to introduce himself, not to apologize. He looked at her for a moment with gray eyes that were neither cold nor warm, but simply direct in the way of someone who had long ago decided that looking away from things did not make them easier. "You'll want to come inside," he said. "It'll be dark in an hour." He did not wait to see if she followed. Wren picked up her bags. Inside the house was clean and spare, and smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and something else beneath those things. Something that had no name, but felt like the inside of a place that had once been full of a particular kind of life, and was now very quietly not. The kitchen was large and functional, with a table that could seat 6 pushed against the east wall. A door off the kitchen led somewhere. A staircase rose from the front room. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace in the main room, there were 2 framed photographs and a small wooden carving of a horse that had been handled enough to shine at the edges. Wren did not look at the photographs. Not yet. Boone sat at the kitchen table. He placed in front of him a folded piece of paper that Wren recognized even from across the room as the letter she had written 6 weeks ago in response to an advertisement she had found tucked between the pages of a community bulletin, handwritten in a woman's precise, careful script. She had answered it because it was the last reasonable option available to her, and she had told herself that was enough of a reason. Looking at it now, laid flat on someone else's table, in a house she had traveled the better part of 2 weeks to reach, she was less certain. Boone unfolded it and read it in full, though she had the impression he had already read it before she walked through the door. He read it the way a man reads something he is trying to understand rather than something he is trying to remember. Then he folded it again and set it down and looked at Ida, who had taken up a position near the stove with the practiced neutrality of someone who intended to be useful and harmless simultaneously. "When did you place this?" he asked. "8 weeks ago. And you told me nothing about it." "No." The single syllable landed in the room without apology. Ida's hands were clasped in front of her now, and she met his gaze steadily, which told Wren something about the woman before she knew anything else about her. She was not afraid of him. She was braced for his anger the way you brace for weather you've seen before, and know will pass. "I am not a horse to be managed," Boone said, and his voice was quiet, which made it more rather than less. "No," Ida said again. "You are a man who hasn't slept past 4 in the morning in 3 years, eats 1 real meal a day, if I stand over him, and spent last Christmas fixing the water pump when there was nothing wrong with the water pump." She paused. "I have watched you disappear, Boone. I have watched it slow and steady, like something going under. I am not sorry for what I did. I am only sorry I didn't say it to your face before now." The kitchen held the silence that followed. Boone looked at the table. Then he looked at Wren, who had stood through this exchange with her bag still in her hands, not because she intended to leave, but because setting them down had begun to feel like a statement she wasn't certain she was ready to make. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly, more like a man who had decided that whatever came next would be easier horizontal than standing. Wren set her bags by the door and sat. He told her the situation plainly and without decoration, which she found she respected even before she had decided anything else about him. The ranch was his. He had not placed the advertisement. He had not until this afternoon known anyone was coming. Ida had acted without his knowledge or consent, a fact he was going to need time to fully reckon with. He was not going to put her out on the road in the dark. But she needed to understand that nothing had been agreed to. Nothing was promised, and he was not a man who made arrangements he did not intend to keep, which meant he did not make them carelessly. "That's fair," Wren said when he finished. He looked at her as though fairness was not the response he had been prepared for. "There is a situation," he continued after a moment. "One that has nothing to do with any of this, but that exists regardless." He glanced at Ida, who gave a small nod. "There's a man on this ranch who is sick. Has been for 5 days. Fever that won't break, and the nearest doctor is 2 days' ride. Cobb has worked this land for 20 years. He's 63 years old, and he's been sleeping in the bunkhouse, burning up, while I've done everything I know how to do. And it hasn't been enough." Wren was quiet for a moment. "What have you tried?" Something shifted in Boone's expression. Not hope, exactly. More like the door to it cracked open an inch. "Everything in the supply box. Cold cloths. Broth when he'll take it." "What kind of fever? Does he sweat? Or does he stay dry?" "Dry, mostly. Some sweating at night." "Is there a cough?" "Wet. Comes in fits." Wren stood up. "Show me where he is." Boone looked at her for a moment longer, measuring something she couldn't entirely name. Then he stood too, and led her out the back of the kitchen and across the yard to the bunkhouse without another word between them. Cobb was a narrow man, made narrower by illness, lying in the bunk nearest the small window with a blanket pulled to his chest, despite the residual warmth of the evening. His breathing was audible from the doorway. A sound that Wren's body recognized before her mind named it the particular wet, labored pull of lungs working against something that had settled in them. His skin had the dull, papery quality of a high fever sustained too long. She moved to him and began her examination without asking permission, because asking permission was for situations where there was time to spare, and this was not one of those. She checked his pulse at the wrist, the temperature at his forehead and his neck, the color of the whites of his eyes, the way he flinched when she pressed gently at his chest, and the way he breathed when she told him to breathe deep. Boone stood in the doorway and watched. He did not hover. He did not ask questions while she was working. He simply stayed close enough to be useful if she needed him, and far enough back not to be in her way. And she noticed that the way she noticed everything cataloged it and filed it without comment. When she finished, she stood and turned to Boone. He needs to sweat this out, not just wet cloths, real heat controlled. And there are two things in your supply box that shouldn't be combined the way they've been given. They're counteracting each other. Has he been given both at once? Boone's jaw tightened. Ida's been managing the doses. I'm not assigning blame. I just need to know. She waited. He nodded once. She turned back to Cobb. Then we stop one tonight and increase the other in the morning. He'll feel worse before he feels better, but that's the fever breaking, not the treatment failing. You'll need to sit with him tonight. I can do that. I know you can. I'll check on him at midnight, and again at 3. She paused. If that's agreeable. He looked at her steadily. This man who had not sent for her, who had not wanted her here, who was standing in the doorway of a bunkhouse in the last light of the evening, with his arms crossed and the expression of someone working through more than one problem at once. You know what you're doing, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes, she said simply. I do. They walked back across the yard in the growing dark without speaking, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had just discovered they might be capable of working alongside each other, which was different from liking each other, different from trusting each other, but was in its own way a place to start. In the kitchen, Ida had made supper. She set 3 plates without being asked and sat at the table with the decisiveness of a woman who had said her piece and intended to get on with things. They ate. The food was good. Outside, the wind came down off the high ground to the north and moved through the grass in long, slow waves that Wren could hear through the window above the sink. There's a room at the end of the hall, Boone said, when the plates were cleared. It's been empty a while. Clean, though. Ida keeps it. Wren looked at him. What are you offering? He was quiet for a moment. 3 months. You tend Cobb until he's on his feet, then keep an eye on the general health of the outfit through winter. In return room and board, and enough to cover your passage back east, come spring with extra besides. He paused. If you want to go back east. The addendum at the end was small enough that it might have been nothing. Wren chose to treat it as nothing. That's a reasonable arrangement, she said. I'm a reasonable man. I'll need access to whatever medicinal stores you have. You'll have them, and if I tell you something needs to be done differently regarding Cobb's treatment, I need that to be heard and not argued. Something almost resembling a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, slow and dry. You'll find I don't argue when someone knows more than I do. I just need to be sure they do. That seems reasonable too, Wren said. Boone nodded once, pushed back from the table, and took his hat from the hook by the door. He paused at the threshold. The way she would come to understand was simply how he moved through doorways, as though each one required a moment of consideration. "I'll take the first watch with Cobb. Come at midnight, like you said." Then he was gone, and the kitchen held only the two women and the sound of the wind and the low tick of a clock somewhere in the front room. Ida looked at Wren across the table with the particular expression of someone who has gambled significantly and is only now beginning to calculate what they have wagered. "He's not what I expected," Wren said before Ida could say whatever she was working up to saying. "He's not what anyone expects," Ida replied, and the warmth in her voice when she said it was the particular kind that comes from years and real knowledge. "He was different before. Not different like another person. Different like the same person with more light in him." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not asking you to fix that. I want you to understand I was not trying to trick either of you. I was trying to stop watching a good man go quiet." Wren considered that for a moment. Then she picked up her bags from beside the door where she'd left them. "Show me the room," she said. It was at the end of the upstairs hall, as Boone had said. The bed was iron-framed with a clean quilt, the window faced west, and on the small table beside the bed there was a candle and a plain ceramic pitcher filled with water that was still cool to the touch, which meant Ida had filled it recently, which meant she had been sure enough about tonight to prepare for it. Wren set her bags on the floor and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the dark shape of the land against a sky going dense with stars. The grass moved in the wind below. The light was still on in the bunkhouse, a warm yellow square in the dark, and she could see the shape of Boone moving past the window once and not again. She began to unpack, not everything, just what she needed for the next few days. It was not a decision exactly, not yet, but it was something adjacent to one, and she allowed it to exist without examining it too closely. Later, when she went down to the kitchen for a glass of water, she noticed for the first time something she had walked past twice without registering. On a shelf beside the back door, lined up with the careful precision of someone who had spent real time on the task, were a row of small glass jars. Each one was labeled in a handwriting that was not Ida's and not Boone's, smaller and more deliberate. The letters even, and close set the ink faded at the edges. The labels named plants and preparations the language of someone who knew what they were doing. Wren stood and looked at those jars for a long time. She did not touch them. Not that night. She only noted them the way she noted everything she did not yet understand carefully and without conclusion, and carried that small, unresolved observation back up the stairs with her to a room in a house she had arrived at 3 hours ago, in a place she had never been, where a man she had not met until tonight was sitting in the dark beside a sick man who needed watching in a ranch with a name she was only beginning to learn the shape of. The wind came in off the high ground. The stars were very bright. Somewhere below in the bunkhouse, Cobb breathed his difficult, labored breath, and Boone Calloway sat beside him, without complaint, in the particular silence of a man who understands that some kinds of keeping watch are simply what you do, because the alternative is not something you are willing to consider. Wren lay down on the clean quilt in the iron-framed bed. She did not sleep immediately, but for the first time in a long time, the dark felt less like something pressing in and more like something simply present, patient and indifferent, the way a landscape is patient, the way distance is patient, the way things that have always been there. Wait without urgency for you to finally look at them. She would check on Cobb at midnight. She would be there when Boone looked up from the chair beside the bunk, and found her in the doorway, steady and unhurried, already reaching for the small kit she had packed with the particular thoroughness of someone who has learned that the moment you need something is never the moment you have time to look for it. But that was later. For now there was only the wind and the stars and the sound of a new place settling into its nighttime sounds around her, and the small particular knowledge that she had unpacked her bags, set her boots by the door, and for the first time since she had left everything she had ever known was not listening for footsteps that meant trouble. That was something. That was, if nothing else, a beginning. Cobb broke his fever on the third morning. Wren knew it before she checked on him the way she always knew, not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of small things. The sound of his breathing had changed in the night, from that wet, resistant labor to something slower and more willing, and when she pushed open the bunkhouse door just after first light, the particular smell of the room had shifted from the sharp, sour edge of active fever to something quieter and stale. The smell of a body that had been fighting hard and had finally, provisionally stopped. Cobb was awake. His eyes were clear for the first time since she had arrived. He looked exhausted in the deep, honest way of someone who has traveled a long distance without moving. And his face had the hollowed quality of 3 days of very little food, but he was present in a way he had not been tracking the room, tracking her as she crossed it. "You're the one who changed the medicine," he said. His voice was rough and thin. "Yes. Felt worse before it got better. I told Boone it would." Cobb was quiet for a moment, studying her with pale eyes that had spent 60 years reading people in the particular way of someone who has worked alongside them rather than above them. "You know your business," he said finally. It was not flattery. It was simply an observation delivered by someone who did not waste observations. "I try to," Wren said, and checked his pulse and his temperature and the sound of his lungs, all of which confirmed what the room had already told her. She left him with instructions to eat something to drink more than he thought he needed and to stay in the bunk until she said otherwise. He received all of this with the resigned dignity of a man who understood that arguing with someone who had just saved his life was a particular kind of foolishness he could not afford. Boone was at the fence line when she came back across the yard, working a section of rail that had come loose in the night wind. He had been up before her. He was always up before her, which she had come to understand was not insomnia or industry in the driven anxious sense, but simply the habit of a man who had organized his entire interior life around the discipline of beginning. As though moving forward at first light was the only reliable way to ensure that moving forward happened at all. She stopped a few feet from where he was working. Cobb's fever broke. Boone straightened. He looked at her, and in that moment, before he arranged his expression into something more measured, she saw something real move through it, something that was relief in its oldest and most unguarded form, the kind that arrives before you have a chance to decide how much of it to show. "He'll need another week of rest before he goes back to full work," she said. "Maybe 10 days. Don't let him tell you otherwise. He'll try. I know. I've already told him I'll know if he does." She paused. He believed me. Something moved at the corner of Boone's mouth. Not a smile, not entirely, but the territory adjacent to one. He turned back to the fence rail and set the post with a single clean strike of the mallet. "Breakfast is on the stove," he said without looking at her. Ida made extra. It was not an invitation exactly. It was simply information delivered in the direction of a person he expected would know what to do with it. Wren went inside and ate breakfast. This was how the days began to form themselves, not by agreement or announcement, but by accumulation, the way a path forms in a field when people walk the same way often enough that the grass simply stops growing there. Wren checked on Cobb in the mornings and evenings. She inventoried the medical stores with a thoroughness that Ida watched with quiet approval, reorganizing the supply shelf in the back room with labels written in her own precise hand, replacing what was old or improperly stored with what was better. She learned the rhythms of the house the way you learn any new place, not by being told, but by paying attention. Which corner of the kitchen caught the morning light and which ran cold, which step on the back stairs groaned and which board in the hallway was loose, which window Boone always checked last thing before coming in from the yard. She noticed that he moved through his own house the way a caretaker moves through a place in his charge. Efficiently, attentively, but with a particular absence of personal claim that she found difficult to name at first, and then one afternoon recognized for what it was. He managed Greystone. He did not live in it. Not in the full sense. Not the way the house seemed to have been lived in once when whoever had organized those jars and written those labels in that careful small hand had been present to do it. The jars remained on the shelf untouched. Wren did not ask, but she had not stopped noticing them either. On the 5th day, a man came. She was in the kitchen garden when the sound of hoofbeats reached her unhurried and deliberate, the sound of someone who knew the property and did not feel the need to announce himself. She straightened up from the row of late-season herbs she had been assessing and shaded her eyes. The man who rode in was somewhere past 50, well-dressed in the manner of someone who understood that appearance was a form of authority and had invested accordingly. He had a broad face, clean-shaved, with the kind of settled confidence that came not from strength of character but from long habituation to being deferred to. He rode a dark horse that was considerably better than average, and did not hurry it. He introduced himself to the yard at large, as Silas Price said it, the way a man says a name that he expects to open doors, and when Boone came out of the barn and shook his hand, there was a particular quality to the handshake on Boone's side, cordial and firm, and utterly without warmth. Wren watched from the garden and went back to her work. But she listened. Silas Price's voice carried without effort the voice of a man accustomed to rooms paying attention to him. He was the presiding magistrate for the territory she gathered the authority on matters of property and record and legal arrangement across a wide swath of land in every direction. He spoke to Boone about boundary lines and a water access matter with a neighboring property, all perfectly reasonable things, the kinds of things that would naturally fall within his purview. He asked after Cobb's health with an expression of genuine concern that was performed well enough to be almost convincing. Then he looked toward the kitchen garden. "I didn't know you had someone new out here," he said. Not to Wren, to Boone. About her in the third person while she was visible and within earshot, which was either carelessness or a specific kind of signal. "Medical help," Boone said. "Cobb's been ill." "I heard that. Glad to know he's improving." A pause that lasted precisely long enough to communicate that the pause was intentional. "Where does she come from?" "East." Another pause. "She have family out here?" "Not that I know of." Silas Price smiled, which was not a warm expression on his face, more the shape of warmth without the substance of it. "Just making sure everything's accounted for," he said pleasantly. "My job is to know who's in the territory and on what basis. Nothing personal." Boone said nothing. He had a talent for silence that Wren was beginning to appreciate, the ability to let a silence stand without filling it, which had the effect of making the person who had last spoken suddenly responsible for everything they had said. Silas Price left after another few minutes of property talk, cordial and unhurried, and the sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded down the road with the same deliberate pace they had arrived with. Wren came in from the garden as Boone crossed the yard. "He always asks that many questions," she said. Boone was quiet for a moment in the way she had come to understand meant he was deciding how much of an answer to give, not because he intended to deceive, but because he was precise about language and did not like saying more than he meant. "With new people, yes." He moved past her toward the barn, and she let him go. But she carried the conversation in the back of her mind for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over with the same careful attention she gave to things that did not yet make complete sense. That evening, she was reorganizing the backroom supply shelf when she found it. She had been working systematically from left to right, and the lower shelf held a collection of older preparations, some predating her arrival by a year or more, stored in small dark glass bottles with hand-lettered labels in that same careful script she recognized from the kitchen jars. She had been setting them aside to cross-reference with the inventory list, and she would have continued doing that without particular pause, except that one bottle stopped her. The label named a preparation she knew. She knew its composition, its correct dosage, its appropriate use. And she knew with the particular certainty of someone who has worked long enough with compounds to recognize them by color and consistency before she even opened the bottle. That what was inside this one was not quite right, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that announced itself, just slightly carefully wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when someone knows enough about them to make the error invisible to anyone who doesn't know more. She set the bottle on the workbench. Then she picked up the next one, and the one after that. By the time Ida called her for supper, she had found 3, all from the same period, all containing the same category of subtle cumulative error, individually unremarkable. Together in the body of a person using them over a long period of time, the kind of thing that would not shorten a life so much as thin it, eroding energy and clarity slowly enough that the person being thinned would have no particular reason to connect cause and effect. She ate supper with Boone and Ida without saying anything about what she had found, because she was not yet certain enough of what she was looking at, and because certainty mattered in her work the way it mattered in few other things. She would be sure before she was anything else, but she noted it and filed it. 3 days later, a storm came in from the north. It arrived in the late afternoon with the particular speed of weather in open country, where there is nothing between the sky and the land to slow it down, and by evening the wind was driving hard against the north face of the house, and the temperature had dropped sharply enough that Wren could see her breath in the yard when she went to close the shutters on the bunkhouse windows. Cobb was much improved by then, sitting up and eating and managing his enforced rest with the barely contained restlessness of a man who considered horizontal an insult to his character, but he was not yet strong enough to do anything practical in weather like this. Wren had made that clear, and he had accepted it with the specific grace of someone who knows when they have lost an argument before they make it. The horses were the problem. Boone had gone to the stable early to secure the animals, but the north pasture gate had come loose in the first gust of the wind, and 4 horses were pressing it from the inside with the particular collective anxiety of prey animals in a storm liable to push through into open land the moment the latch gave. Wren had the gate situation before Boone did simply because she had come around the side of the house from the bunkhouse and saw it first. She did not go back inside to report it. She went straight to the gate and put her weight against it from the outside, which kept the latch from giving, but put her directly in the path of 4 frightened horses, and the full force of the wind, which was now carrying Wren sideways with enough force to sting. Boone came around the corner of the barn 2 minutes later, and stopped for a single second at the sight of her braced against the gate, with both hands flat on the wood, and her hair coming loose in the wind, before he came forward and added his weight to hers, and together they held it, while he worked the latch into the higher slot, the one that wouldn't give, and then drove a spare post into the ground as a brace with 3 efficient strikes of the mallet he had brought from the barn, with the foresight of a man who had done this before. They stood back from the gate. The horses pressed once more, and found it immovable, and began slowly to settle. Wren pushed her hair back from her face. Her coat was soaked through at the shoulders. The rain was still coming hard and sideways, and the sky had gone the particular dark green of serious weather, and she was standing in a field in the middle of it, which was objectively not where she had imagined being when she woke that morning. Boone looked at her. There was water running off the brim of his hat, and his coat was as wet as hers, and his expression contained something she had not seen on him before. Not relief this time, not the careful neutrality of their early conversations, but something closer to amusement, dry and unannounced, the look of a man surprised into a feeling he hadn't scheduled. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The horses needed the gate held." She turned toward the house. The why seemed secondary. He fell into step beside her, and they walked back through the rain together, and neither of them said anything else, but the silence between them had changed. Its character again had lost some further layer of formality, the way surfaces lose their edges when weather moves over them long enough. Inside, Ida had the fire built up and a change of dry clothes already laid out for Wren on the chair nearest the kitchen stove, which meant she had been watching from the window and had decided what was needed before anyone had to ask. She said nothing about it, only handed Wren a towel and went back to whatever she was making on the stove. Wren dried her face and changed her shirt, standing beside the fire, and when she sat at the table with a cup of something hot between her hands, she realized that the particular alertness she had been carrying since she arrived, that background frequency of a person ready to move at short notice, had gone quiet for the first time. Not gone, just quiet. She noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound you have been hearing so long you forgot it was there. Boone came in from the hallway in dry clothes and poured himself coffee and sat at the other end of the table, and the storm worked at the windows and the fire worked at the cold, and none of them said much of anything for a while, which was Wren was beginning to understand one of the better qualities of this house. It could hold silence without being diminished by it. Later, when the storm had settled into steady rain and Ida had gone upstairs, Boone said without particular preamble, "You've been checking the supply shelf." Wren looked at him. "Yes." "Found something?" It was not a question. She had known in an abstract way that she would have to decide when and how to raise what she had found, and she had been waiting for the right configuration of time and context, and this, she decided, was probably it. 3 preparations from roughly the same period, she said, keeping her voice level and informational, because that was the most useful way to say something that was not easy to hear. All slightly wrong in their composition, not dramatically, the kind of wrong that would be almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it and knew what you were looking for. Boone held his coffee cup, but did not drink from it. "Cobb told me he used some of those stores during a stretch of illness he had 2 years ago," Wren continued. "He recovered, but slowly. More slowly than he thought he should have. She paused. He also mentioned you had a similar illness not long before that. The kitchen was very quiet except for the rain. I recovered, Boone said. Yes. She looked at him carefully. But you said yourself you haven't been right since then. Those were your words. I haven't been right since then. She waited. I'm not drawing a conclusion. I'm telling you what I found and what I know, and I'm telling you that I intend to be very thorough about what is currently in this house before I'm finished. He set his cup down. His face had done something complex and gone still again the way deep water looks still from the surface. The preparations on that shelf were restocked a few years back, he said slowly. Silas Price sent over a supply. Said he'd had a surplus from the settlement doctor. Said it was a courtesy. Wren said nothing. She did not need to. The fire worked steadily at the grate. Outside, the rain had softened to a patient, persistent sound, the kind that said it intended to continue through the night and was comfortable with that plan. Boone looked at the middle distance between them, and she could see him turning something over in his mind that was not a small thing. The particular interior movement of a person beginning to look at a familiar landscape from an angle they have never used before, and finding that it looks different from there. I'm not certain of anything yet, Wren said. I want to be clear about that. I don't say things I'm not certain of. I know that, he said, and then after a moment, in a tone that had shed something, I've known that since the first night. She looked at him across the table, this man who moved through his own house like a caretaker, who sat up all night with a sick man, without being asked, who had held a gate in a storm with the practical decisiveness of someone who did not waste time deciding whether things were worth doing when they clearly were. This man who had not wanted her here and had made arrangements for her anyway, who had given her a room and access to his stores and the authority to change his methods when her judgment was better than his, without requiring her to demonstrate it more than once. She picked up her cup. Then we'll be certain together, she said, when there's something certain to say. Boone nodded once. It was the same nod he used for agreements. She had noticed the same one he'd given when she told him how to treat Cobb, the same quiet affirmation of a man who committed to things rather than gesturing toward them. She went to bed that night with the sound of the rain working at the roof above her, and the fire's warmth still in her hands, and the knowledge that the shelf downstairs held 3 bottles that were wrong in ways that could not be accidental, and that Silas Price had sent them, and that Boone Calloway had used them and been ill afterward, and had not recovered to himself since. And she lay in the iron-framed bed in the room that Ida had prepared against her arrival under the quilt and beside the window that faced west. And she looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought about the shape of what she was beginning to understand, turning it with care like something fragile and sharp-edged at once. The wind had dropped. The rain came steady and patient from the south now. And somewhere in the house, a clock marked the hours with the same unhurried pace it had always marked them, in a place that was used to waiting in a house that was beginning slowly and without fanfare to feel like something more than a place to stay until the cold broke and the roads opened and the world resumed its motion. Not home, not yet, not that word, but something with a name she did not have yet, and the particular quality of something worth finding out. The morning after the storm, Boone moved the rocking chair. Wren came downstairs to find it gone from the porch, where it had stood untouched since her arrival, its absence a pale rectangle on the weathered boards where the wood had been protected from the sun. She did not ask about it. She made coffee and went to check on Cobb and came back to find the chair installed in the kitchen corner nearest the fire, its runners settled into the flagstone floor, as though it had always been there and had only briefly been somewhere else by mistake. Ida noticed Wren noticing it. She said nothing, but she set an extra cup on the table in a way that suggested she had opinions about the morning that she was choosing with some effort to keep to herself. The days that followed were the kind that accumulate without announcing themselves, quiet days that seem unremarkable in the living of them and reveal their weight only in retrospect. Cobb continued to improve, moving from the bunkhouse to the main yard, and then against Wren's specific instructions, and entirely predictably attempting to assist with a fence repair on the 8th day. She found him there, standing in the field with a post-hole digger and an expression of elaborate innocence. And she looked at him for a long moment, and then said with the measured precision of someone choosing words for maximum effect, that if he reopened the consolidation in his left lung by straining it before it had fully cleared the next fever, would not be so cooperative about breaking. Cobb put the post-hole digger down. Boone, who had been working the next section of fence and had witnessed this exchange from a distance of 30 feet, did not smile. But the line of his shoulders changed in a way that was adjacent to it. He started leaving things, not gifts, not in any declared sense, more like practical attentions that arrived without comment. The lantern in the back room where Wren worked in the evenings was replaced with a larger one that gave better light. A second chair appeared at the workbench. When the temperature dropped sharply midweek, and the room she slept in proved to have a gap at the base of the window frame that let in a thread of cold air, she came upstairs after supper to find the gap packed with new caulking still faintly damp. He had done it that afternoon, while she was with Cobb without mentioning it and without waiting to see if she noticed. She noticed. She also noticed that the chair in the kitchen corner, the rocking chair from the porch, was placed at exactly the right angle to the fire to be warm without being hot, and that the footrest had been moved to match the length of her legs rather than his. She thought about that for longer than she intended to. 2 weeks into her time at Greystone, she found the notebook. She had been working through the last section of the backroom shelf, and the notebook was tucked behind a row of older preparation jars, small and dark-covered at spine, soft with handling. She would have simply moved it to the side of the workbench, except that it fell open when she picked it up, and the page it opened stopped her. It was a record in that careful small handwriting she knew now of a particular preparation made in late autumn with notes on the harvest timing and the drying method and the dosage calibration, and at the bottom of the page, in the same hand, but with a slight difference in pressure, as though written more quickly or at a different time, 2 lines that were not record-keeping at all. They read, "The ironweed came in better than last year. B brought the whole bundle in from the east field, still tied, didn't say anything about it, just left it on the workbench. He knows, I think, even when he doesn't say." Wren stood at the workbench and read those 2 lines twice. Then she closed the notebook carefully and set it where she had found it, and she stood for a moment with her hand resting lightly on its cover in the particular stillness of someone who has just understood something they were not expecting to understand. She did not mention it to Boone, not that evening, not yet. But she carried it with her the way she was beginning to carry several things that belonged to this house and the people in it quietly and without yet knowing what to do with them. It was Ida who began to talk on a gray afternoon when the 2 of them were in the kitchen together and the house was empty of everyone else. Boone out at the far pasture, and Cobb finally cleared for light work and grateful enough for it to be somewhere else. Ida talked the way people talk when they have been waiting a long time for someone to talk to, not with urgency, but with the ease of pressure finally finding a release. She talked about the ranch as it had been about the years before the long illness, about a woman named Cecily who had come to Greystone as a young bride and had taken to the land with a completeness that surprised everyone, including herself. She had been a reader, had ordered books from the nearest settlement at every opportunity, and read them in the rocking chair by the fire in winter and on the porch in summer, and had a habit of reading passages aloud to whoever happened to be nearby, whether they wanted to hear them or not. She had been practical in the way that people are practical when they choose it, rather than having it required of them, and she had learned the properties of the plants that grew in the region around Greystone with the same systematic attention she gave to everything that interested her, which was considerable. She had made the preparations on the shelf. She had written the notebook. She had labeled the jars in the kitchen with that careful hand. She had been ill for nearly 2 years before she died, Ida said, and her voice shifted when she said it, going quieter and more careful. A slow decline. Difficult to track the progress of because there were good periods and hard ones, and no clear line separating them. Boone had done everything he knew how to do, and had watched it not be enough, and had carried that with him in the specific way of someone who could not stop believing that enough effort should have produced a different result. He hasn't touched her things, Ida said when she had been quiet for a moment. Not her books or her jars or the chair. He moved the chair off the porch after the second winter because he said the weather was getting into the wood. I think he couldn't look at it anymore. She paused. And then he put it back inside. Wren was quiet. He's a good man, Ida said in the tone of someone stating something they consider settled. He was a good man before, and he's a good man now. He's just been living like someone waiting for permission to be anything else. Wren looked at her coffee cup and thought about the gap in the window frame and the larger lantern and the footrest adjusted to the right height. What was she like? Wren asked. Cecily. Ida smiled and it changed her whole face. Honest, she said. Not the kind of honest that's really just unkindness with a better excuse. The kind that trusts people enough to tell them the truth. She said once that she thought most people were lonelier than they needed to be because they kept showing each other the version of themselves they thought was acceptable. A pause. Boone used to argue with her about it. Said some things were private. She said there was a difference between private and hidden, and he knew it. Ida looked at Wren. She was usually right. That evening, Boone came in from the far pasture after dark, which happened sometimes when a section of work ran long, and he was tired in the visible way of physical labor sustained past the point of comfort. Wren had kept supper warm. He sat and ate without ceremony, and she sat across from him with the notebook on the workbench in the back room, still very much in her mind. And after a while she said without any particular approach to it, Ida told me about Cecily today. Boone set his fork down. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her, and there was nothing guarded in it which surprised her. She had expected him to close down to give her the careful, measured response of someone protecting a boundary. Instead, he just looked tired and honest, the way people look when they are too worn down to manage the distance they would otherwise maintain. "What did she tell you?" he asked. "Enough," Wren said. That she was remarkable. That she made those preparations on the shelf. That she read to anyone who stood still long enough. She paused. That you've been waiting for something ever since. He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that the fire behind him settled and shifted and sent a brief shower of sparks up the flue. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, and unhurried, the voice of someone who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it fully. He told her about Cecily in the way Ida had described not the illness, not the end, but the ordinary specific things. The way she named all the horses and held to each name with a logic she was willing to explain at length if challenged. The way she had a habit of sitting with one foot tucked under her that she was perpetually told was unladylike and continued to do anyway because she found it comfortable and didn't see the relevance. The way she could be completely silent and completely present at the same time, which was, he said, rarer than people understood. He said she would have liked you, and then looked briefly surprised at himself for having said it and did not take it back. Wren received that in the quiet way she received things she didn't know what to do with immediately. She filed it and let it sit. She kept a notebook, Wren said. In the back room. I know. I found it by accident. I didn't read it only a few lines. I wanted you to know that. He nodded. There was something in the nod that was different from his usual acknowledgments, softer at the edges. She wrote in it every few days. Said it helped her think. He looked at the fire. I haven't been able to open it. You don't have to. I know. A pause. But it's there. And it means something that it's there. She told him about the doctor then, not because the evening had asked for it, but because it had created a space where true things could be said, and she had been carrying hers long enough. She told it simply without self-pity, which was the only way she knew how to tell it. She had known the doctor was wrong. She had documented what she knew with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the truth needed to be legible to people who had not seen what she had seen. She had made her report and been precise, and had expected precision to be enough, and had discovered that precision was not on its own a match for position and influence, and the particular social machinery that protects those who already hold power. She had lost her place, her livelihood, the small rented room, the carefully built professional life. She had stood in the office of the man who told her she was dismissed, and she had not cried because she had learned early that tears in professional settings were used against the person who shed them, and she had kept her spine straight and her voice even, and she had walked out with her notes in her bag and her credentials in her pocket, and almost nothing else. "You did the right thing," Boone said when she was done. "Yes," she said. "It took a long time to feel that way. It still does sometimes. That's not the same as being wrong." She looked at him. "No, it isn't." The fire had gone down to deep coals. The lamp on the table cast a warm, limited light, and outside the windows the night was very quiet. The particular quiet of open country after weather when the land lies still and the sky shows everything it has. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The things Silas Price sent. The preparations. Did you know him well when Cecily was ill?" Boone was still for a moment. "He was around. He was always around. That's the nature of the position. He handled the legal records, the property matters. When someone dies, he's the one who signs what needs signing." He paused. "He was present. He presented himself as helpful. I was not at the time in a position to assess things carefully." "No," Wren said. "You wouldn't have been." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this since the night I told you about the bottles. What do you think?" She chose her words with the same care she always chose them, the care of someone who had learned that words once out belonged to the situation and not to the person who'd spoken them. I think Silas Price is a man who has built his authority carefully and over a long time, and that men like that do not build authority without also building the means to maintain it. I think he has interests in this territory that are not visible from the front, and I think he has found it useful for reasons I don't entirely understand yet to have you in a particular condition. Not ill, not broken, just reduced. Boone looked at the table. And I think, Wren said more quietly, that whatever he used to reduce you, he also used on Cecily. Whether before or during her illness, I can't say. But the preparations he sent have a specific effect over time, and 2 of the symptoms Ida described in her last months are consistent with that effect. The silence that followed this was different from any silence they had shared before. It was not comfortable, and it was not empty. It had weight to it. The weight of something being set down that had been carried for a long time without a name. Boone pushed back from the table and went to the window, and he stood, with his back to the room, for a long time, one hand resting on the frame, looking out into the dark. Wren did not fill the silence. She understood from the quality of it that it needed to be what it was and not something else. When he turned back, his face had the particular exhaustion of genuine grief, not new grief, but old grief, looked at from a new angle, which is its own particular weight. I need to be sure, he said. I know. I need to be sure too. She held his gaze. But I wanted you to know what I was looking for before I find it. You deserve to know that much. He came back to the table. He did not sit. He stood and looked at her, and in the lamplight his face was open in a way she had not seen it be. The careful neutrality gone replaced by something that was real and unmanaged and slightly rough at the edges in the way real things are rough when they haven't been prepared for an audience. Why are you telling me this? He asked, not suspiciously, genuinely, as though the answer mattered and he intended to listen to it. Because you're the one it happened to, Wren said. And because I have spent the last several years in the company of people who withheld the truth because they thought they were protecting something. And I would rather tell you something hard and be useful to you than protect you from it and be useless. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, Cecily would have said exactly that. And the way he said it was not a comparison. It was something else, something that had no easy category, the recognition of a quality seen clearly and named without apology. He said goodnight and went upstairs, and Wren sat alone at the kitchen table with the fire down to its coals, and the lamp burning low, and the sound of the house settling around her. She looked at the rocking chair in the corner. She thought about a woman who had named horses and read aloud and written in a small notebook and made preparations on a shelf that were still there, still useful, still carrying the careful knowledge of someone who had understood that paying attention to the world was its own form of respect. She thought about Silas Price and the bottles and the handwriting on the label that was not Cecily's. She thought about the way he had looked at her on his visits, that quality of surveillance dressed as courtesy. She thought about Boone at the window, one hand on the frame, the shape of a man looking at something he had not let himself look at directly in a very long time. Then she got up and banked the fire and turned down the lamp and went upstairs to her room, and she lay in the dark under the quilt and listened to the quiet of the ranch settling into its nighttime sounds, the distant movement of horses in the stable, the low creak of timber cooling the long, even sound of open land that never fully stilled. She was not the same person who had arrived with 2 bags and a letter and a very specific variety of having nothing left to lose. She was not yet certain what person she was instead. But she was in a house that had shown her its real face slowly and without flattery, and she had shown it something of hers in return, and neither of them had looked away. That was not nothing. Outside her window, the stars were very clear, and the land lay open in every direction under them, wide and unhurried and indifferent in the generous way of things that do not need you to understand them to remain what they are. Tomorrow she would finish the inventory. Tomorrow she would be certain. And in the morning she was nearly sure the coffee would already be on when she came downstairs, and the kitchen would be lit and warm, and Boone Calloway would be there in the quiet way he was always there, doing the work of the day the way he did every day, which was with everything he had, and without asking anyone to notice. She noticed. She had noticed for some time. The certainty came on a Tuesday. Wren had been working through the final cross-reference between the preparation records she had reconstructed from Cecily's notebook and the supply log that Ida kept in the back of the kitchen drawer, a plain ledger that recorded what came in and when, and from whom. She had been methodical about it, the way she was methodical about everything that mattered, building the picture piece by piece, rather than reaching for the conclusion before the evidence was complete. The evidence was complete on Tuesday. She sat at the workbench in the back room with the ledger open before her and the 3 bottles she had set aside weeks ago arranged in a line beside it, and she looked at what she had built, and it was unambiguous. The preparations had come from Silas Price's supply in 2 separate deliveries, the first arriving during Cecily's 2nd year of illness, the second arriving 8 months later. The compounds in the bottles were not dangerous in the way that a poison is dangerous. They were dangerous in the quieter, more patient way of something that simply takes what a person has slowly and without drama, eroding the body's capacity to repair itself, flattening the energy and clarity that a person needs to fight what is already fighting them. For someone already ill, the effect would be a kind of gentle suffocation, a ceiling placed on recovery, the illness doing its work, and the preparations ensuring that the body could not fully meet it. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went to find Boone. He was in the stable working on the tack for the 2nd horse, a methodical repair job that his hands could do without much direction from his mind, which she had come to understand was sometimes necessary for him. He looked up when she came in, and whatever was in her face told him before she said anything, because he set the leather down and gave her his full attention without being asked. She told him what she had found. She told it plainly, as she had promised herself she would, without softening the edges into something more comfortable than the truth warranted. The dates, the compounds, the progression, what it would have meant for someone in Cecily's condition during those particular months. Boone did not move while she spoke. He stood with his hands at his sides and his face very still, and she watched him receive it the way she had watched people receive hard news in her working life, that particular interior processing that has no outward drama, but is in its way the most significant thing happening in a room. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she could hear the horses moving in their stalls and the wind working at the stable roof, and her own breathing steadier than she expected. "You're certain?" he said. "Yes." He turned away from her and walked to the far end of the stable and stood at the window there, the small square one that looked out at the east field. The field she now knew from Cecily's notebook as the one where the ironweed came in every autumn. His back was to her. His hands, she could see from where she stood, were not quite still. She did not go to him. She understood from everything she had learned about him that what he needed in this moment was not comfort and not company, but the space to stand inside something terrible, and let it be terrible without having to manage how that appeared to anyone else. She understood this because she had needed the same thing herself more than once, and had almost never been given it. So she waited. She waited long enough that the light in the stable shifted with the movement of clouds outside, and a horse in the nearest stall turned to look at her with the mild, ancient patience of animals in the presence of human trouble. And still she waited. When he turned back, his face was different. Not broken, not collapsed, just stripped of the last layer of the careful management he had been maintaining since she had arrived, and possibly long before that. What was underneath was grief honest and old and not finished with him yet, and beneath that something harder and more present, anger, the specific kind that comes not from surprise but from understanding. He was in this house, Boone said. During that time, he came to help with the legal matters, the land records. He brought the preparations himself, carried them in, put them on the shelf. He stopped. He stood in my kitchen. Yes. And all of it was, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I don't know his full reason yet, Wren said. I know what he did, and I know the effect of it. The reason is still a piece I'm working toward. I know the reason, Boone said, and his voice had gone quiet in the way it went quiet when it mattered most. There's water on this land. Eastern boundary, deep source enough to supply half the territory. He's known about it longer than I have. He's been waiting for me to be in a position where I had no choice but to sell. He looked at her. He needed me reduced, not destroyed, just reduced enough. She looked at him. Ida said you hadn't been right since the illness 2 years ago. I haven't. You're not still taking anything from that shelf. No. Cobb's been doing better since you changed the stores. She absorbed that without comment because the implications of it were too large to comment on briefly, and she was not willing to be brief with something that size. What do you want to do? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment, and she recognized the quality of the look, the same one he had given her the first morning in the kitchen when she had told him how to treat Cobb, and he had needed to satisfy himself that she knew what she was doing before he committed to the course. He was doing that now, not with her competence, but with her, assessing, deciding. I want to be certain he can't do this again, he said, to anyone. Then we need more than what I have. We need testimony. Ida saw the deliveries. She can speak to what arrived and when. That's something. Wren paused. But Price is the presiding authority in this territory. His word carries the weight of the position. We need something that doesn't depend on his goodwill to stand. There's a woman in the settlement south of here, Boone said slowly. Maren Holst. She was midwife and healer for 20 years before her hands got too unsteady. She knew Cecily. She was called in twice during the illness. He paused. She never thought Cecily should have declined the way she did. She said so. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. She might understand now. She might. They looked at each other across the stable in the thin afternoon light, and the thing between them in that moment was not romance and not strategy, but something that preceded both of those things, the recognition of two people who have looked at the same reality and arrived at the same place inside it. Go to her, Wren said. Today, if you can. I'll write down everything I've found in a form that can be handed to someone else, clear enough that it doesn't require me to explain it." She paused. "And I'll write a copy for safekeeping. Somewhere Price can't reach." Boone nodded. It was the agreement nod, the one that meant the thing was decided and the discussion was over and the work could begin. He moved toward the stable door, and as he passed her, he paused for just a moment, not touching her, not saying anything, just pausing in the way he had a habit of pausing in doorways, as though each threshold was a moment worth marking. Then he went. She went back to the workbench and wrote for 2 hours without stopping the detailed, precise documentation of someone who had done this before and understood that legibility was a form of power. When she finished, she had 4 pages in her hand and a copy folded into the back of Cecily's notebook, which she returned to its place on the shelf behind the row of jars. It was the right place for it. Silas Price arrived the following morning. He came alone, which was unusual, and early, which was deliberate, the calculated earliness of someone who wanted to find people before they had arranged themselves for the day. Wren was in the kitchen when she heard the hoofbeats, and she went to the window and saw him dismounting in the yard, and she felt the particular alertness that she had learned in the time before she came to Greystone to associate with a specific category of danger. Not the sharp, obvious danger of a thing coming at you, the patient institutional danger of someone with authority and the willingness to use it. Boone had not yet returned from the settlement. She had not expected him before midday. She went to the door and opened it before Silas had reached the porch steps. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved through his expression quickly. A slight recalibration. He had expected she understood to find her inside and be seen from a position of approach. Finding her already at the door, already looking at him steadily, was a small shift in the geometry of the encounter, and he was attentive enough to feel it. "Miss Adler," he said pleasantly. "Is Boone about—" "He's away from the ranch this morning." "Ah." He looked past her into the house, and she did not move aside. "I'll wait then, if you don't mind. I have some documents requiring his signature property records. Standard procedure." "I can tell him you called." He smiled at her, the smile that was the shape of warmth without its contents. "I'd rather wait," he said. "It's a considerable ride back to the settlement." He moved toward the porch steps, and she stepped aside because refusing him entry would have tipped her hand in a way she was not ready to tip it, and she needed to know what he had come to do. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee she made him, and he talked about property records and boundary adjustments and the general business of the territory, with the easy fluency of a man for whom this was all perfectly normal. And she sat across from him and listened and answered what she had to answer and watched him. He was waiting for something. She could feel it beneath the conversation, the way you feel a current beneath the surface of water that looks still from above. "You've been busy," he said at a natural pause in the conversation. He nodded toward the back room, where the workbench was visible through the open door. "With the medical stores. Cobb needed proper treatment." "Of course." A pause. "And you've been thorough about it, I understand. Reorganizing, reviewing what was there." She looked at him without expression. "That's what the work requires." "Naturally." He set his coffee cup down with the careful placement of someone making a point. "I've always found that the most useful people in a household are the ones who understand where their usefulness ends." He met her eyes. "You have a particular skill, and it's been valuable here. Cobb as well. The stores are organized. By spring, Boone will have what he needs, and you'll be free to move on." He paused. That was always the arrangement, wasn't it? It was. Good. He said it with the finality of someone closing a chapter. I only raise it because there has been some talk in the settlement about the situation here. A woman in the house, no formal arrangement, no clear standing. He shook his head with every appearance of sympathetic concern. People will talk, and talk, as I'm sure you know from your time before, has a way of becoming its own kind of record. She understood him completely. He was telling her in the language of the perfectly positioned threat that he could make her presence here a problem, that he had the standing to question it, to formalize the questioning in ways that would require answers, and that the answers she had. A woman with no family in the territory, no property, no legal standing of her own, would not be sufficient to the questions he could ask. She held his gaze and said nothing. He waited for the response that most people gave him in moments like this, the slight retreat, the qualifying backpedal, the signal that the message had been received and would be acted on. She had seen men like Silas Price operate before in different circumstances and different rooms, and she knew that what they relied on, more than any specific power they held, was the willingness of other people to manage the situation so they didn't have to. She was not going to manage it for him. The kitchen door opened. Boone came in still in his riding coat, and he read the room in the way he read everything quickly, and without showing that he was doing it. He looked at Silas. He looked at Wren. He took off his coat and hung it on the hook, and said with the complete absence of surprise of a man who has already decided how this conversation is going to go, Silas. Boone. Silas rose from his chair with the ease of someone who intends to control the terms of the encounter. Good timing. I was just discussing the spring property review with Miss Adler. There are several documents requiring your attention. Sit down, Boone said. Something shifted in Silas's expression, the very slight adjustment of a man recalibrating. He sat. Boone sat across from him, not beside Wren, not between them, but directly across from Silas, and he placed his hands flat on the table and looked at him with the same gray directness he brought to everything, the look that was not hostile, but was absolutely without deference. Maren Holst sends her regards, Boone said. A silence followed that had a specific texture, the texture of something that had been suspended for a long time, suddenly losing its suspension. Silas did not move. He was good. He was very good. And in the second and a half that followed, he reorganized his expression into something that was almost equanimity, almost the calm face of a man with nothing to manage. But Wren had been watching him carefully since he arrived, and she saw before he finished reorganizing the thing that moved through his face in that first unguarded fraction of a second. Fear, specific and informed. The fear of someone who knows exactly what a particular name means when said in a particular tone. She's well, I hope, Silas said. She's well. She's been well enough to write a detailed account of her observations during the last years of Cecily's illness. She said she'd been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Boone paused. Wren asked them. Silas looked at Wren. She looked back at him, and she understood that this was the moment in which he was deciding what she was, what category of threat or opportunity, and she let him look because she had nothing to hide from the looking, and he had everything to hide from hers. This is a serious accusation to be building toward, Silas said carefully, the voice of a man keeping his options open. I want you to understand the weight of it. I have authority in this territory. I have records. I have the standing of a long public service, and a single account of events that occurred during a tragic illness is not going to undermine that. No, Boone agreed. One account alone probably wouldn't. He paused. Wren's documentation alongside Marin's account, alongside Ida's record of the deliveries and their dates, that's a different weight. Silas was quiet. You want the land, Boone said. You've always wanted the land, and you needed me, willing or broken. That was the calculation. His voice had not risen. It had, if anything, gone quieter, which made it more rather than less. You had access to my house during the worst time of my life. You used it. The kitchen held the silence. Silas placed both hands on the table in a gesture that was almost a mirror of Boone's, but where Boone's were still Silas's, were working a faint tension in the fingers. What do you want? He asked at last, and his voice had shed its pleasantness and become simply businesslike. The voice of a man who has moved from one kind of transaction to another. I want you to ride back to the settlement, and I want you to stay there, Boone said. I want you to forget the water rights on the eastern boundary. I want the documents you had me signing in years when I wasn't capable of reading what I signed to be voided quietly and permanently, and I want Marin's account and Wren's documentation filed with the circuit magistrate's office in your stead, so that if anything unusual happens to this ranch or anyone on it, there is a record that already exists. He looked at him steadily. In exchange, I don't pursue what you did to Cecily through every channel available to me, which are more than you currently think they are. Silas sat with that for a long time. Wren watched his face and understood that she was watching a man do the mathematics of his situation, tallying what he had against what had been built against him, calculating the cost of various paths. She had seen it before. It looked different in different faces, but it always had the same quality, the narrowing of a very particular attention, the moment when ambition decided what it could afford. He stood up. He put on his hat with the same neat, deliberate gesture he had arrived with, adjusting the brim in the way of someone maintaining the appearance of composure as a form of dignity. I'll be in touch about the property records, he said. And his voice was pleasant again, which was the worst version of his voice, the one that said nothing was resolved and everything was simply deferred. He walked out. The hoofbeats moved away from the ranch with the same measured pace they always had, unhurried, certain of themselves, and Wren stood at the window and watched until the shape of him disappeared around the line of cottonwoods at the bottom of the road. Then she turned. Boone was still at the table, his hands still flat on the surface, looking at the door. He had the look of a man who has done something he needed to do, and is only now in the doing's aftermath beginning to feel how much it cost him. She sat down across from where Silas had been sitting. He'll be in touch about the property records, she said. I know. That wasn't finished. No. He looked at her. It wasn't. She held his gaze. What aren't you telling me? He was quiet for a moment in the specific way that meant he was deciding how to say something rather than whether to say it, which she had learned to recognize as its own form of honesty. Before I went to Marin, I stopped at the circuit magistrate's office to look at the records. He paused. There are documents with my signature on them from the period after Cecily died. 3 of them. I don't remember signing any of them. One of them contains a clause. He stopped. A clause that transfers the water rights to a private holding company if I die without a legal heir. She was very still. Silas holds the company, Boone said. Or someone does on paper. and Silas controls whoever that is. If you have no legal heir, Wren said slowly, hearing the shape of what she was hearing, I have no children. I have no family in the territory. I have no wife. He looked at her. As of this moment, legally, I have no one with standing to inherit or contest anything. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods at the bottom of the road, and the sound of it was the same sound it had always been, patient and indifferent and continuous, the sound of a landscape that had been here long before any of this, and intended to be here long after. Wren looked at the table. She looked at her hands on it. She thought about the document in the circuit magistrate's office and the clause in it, and the word heir and what it meant in practical terms, in legal terms, in the specific terms of the situation in front of her. She looked up at Boone. He was already looking at her, and there was something in it she had not seen there before. Not the careful assessment, not the guarded neutrality, not even the open honesty of the harder conversations they had had. Something more uncertain than any of those. Something that was underneath its caution, very much a question. She understood what he was not asking. She understood what she would have to decide. And she understood, sitting in that kitchen in the particular quality of afternoon light that came through the west window at that hour, with the smell of coffee and wood smoke and the faint herb-dry scent of the preparations on the backroom shelf, that the decision she was being faced with was not actually the one that frightened her. The one that frightened her was the one underneath it. The one that had been growing slowly and without announcement for weeks in the rocking chair, moved from the porch, and the lantern replaced with a better one, and the footrest set to her height, and the coffee already on every morning when she came downstairs. That was the decision she had not let herself look at directly. She looked at it now. She did not answer him that afternoon, not because she didn't know what she thought, but because she understood that some answers given too quickly belonged to the pressure of the moment rather than to the person giving them, and she had learned at considerable cost to tell the difference. She told him she needed to think. He nodded the agreement nod, the one that meant he had heard her and would wait, and she went upstairs and sat on the edge of the iron-framed bed in the room that had been prepared for her arrival, and looked at the west window for a long time while the light changed outside it. She thought about the clause in the document. She thought about the word heir and what it meant legally and what it meant practically and what it meant in every other sense that was harder to name. She thought about the difference between a decision made because there was no other choice and a decision made because it was the true one. And she thought about how those two things could occupy the same space without being the same thing, and how important it was for reasons she could not entirely articulate, but felt with complete clarity that she knew which one she was making. She thought about a doctor in a place she had left behind, and a report she had written with shaking hands, and a steady pen, and the morning she had walked out into cold air with everything she had built for herself in a bag over her shoulder. She thought about the particular freedom of having nothing left to protect, and how she had not understood until very recently that freedom of that kind could become a habit, a way of living at a permanent remove from anything that could be lost. She thought about Boone at the fence line in the early light working before she was awake. She thought about the lantern, the footrest, the gap in the window frame packed with new caulking while she was elsewhere. She thought about the night by the fire when he had talked about Cecily without looking away, without performing the grief or minimizing it, just holding it plainly in the air between them and trusting her to receive it for what it was. She thought about being trusted, She thought about what it had felt like the first time she realized he trusted her judgment without requiring her to earn it again, each time how unfamiliar that had been. How she had not known what to do with it initially and had simply continued working and let it accumulate until she could no longer pretend it was unremarkable. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed when the light went fully golden outside the window. The last long light of the day lying flat across the grass and turning everything it touched the color of something almost warm enough to keep. From downstairs, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the house in the early evening, the low movement of the fire being built up a door, the particular sound of Boone's boots on the back steps that she could distinguish now from any other sound in the house and had been able to for some time without acknowledging that she could. She went downstairs. He was at the stove. He had started supper without Ida, who had gone to sit with a neighbor through a difficult evening and would not be back until late, and he was doing it with the same practical competence he brought to every task that needed doing nothing more and nothing less. He looked up when she came in and read her face with the same attention he always gave her, and then he went back to what he was doing, and she sat at the table, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I've been thinking about the claws," she said. He kept his attention on the stove. "So have I. There are two ways to address it." She paused. "The first is to challenge the documents on the basis of coercion or incapacity, given what we have that's possible. It would take time and it would require the circuit court, and it would be public in ways that may not serve you. And the second," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "The second is that the clause becomes irrelevant." He set down what he was holding. He turned. He looked at her across the kitchen in the evening light, and there was nothing strategic in his face, nothing calculated. He was simply looking at her with all the directness he always brought to looking and waiting. "I want to say something first," Wren said, "before anything else is decided." "All right." "I am not going to do this because of the clause." She held his gaze. "I am not going to do this because I have nowhere else to go, or because the situation requires it, or because it resolves a legal problem neatly. I have spent a considerable portion of my life doing things because they were necessary, and telling myself that was the same as choosing them, and I am done with that." She stopped. "If this is something I do, it will be because I am choosing it, freely, with full knowledge of what I am choosing and what I am not." He was very still. "And what I am choosing," she said more quietly, "is this. You. This house. This land. Cobb arguing with me about when he's well enough to work, and Ida making extra, and the notebook on the shelf, and the coffee already on in the mornings." She paused. "I am choosing those things because they are the first things in a long time that have felt like mine. Not by accident, not by necessity, but because something in them fits the shape of what I actually am, and I did not know until I had been here long enough to stop managing that fact that I had been looking for that." Boone crossed the kitchen. He did not hurry. He moved with the same deliberate, unhurried quality that was simply how he was, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her from a distance of 2 feet with an expression that was open in a way she had come to understand was rare for him, something unguarded and careful. At once the way you hold something you are not yet certain you are allowed to have. "I didn't send for you," he said. "I know. I want you to understand that what I'm about to say has nothing to do with the clause or the land or any of it. I know that too." He reached out and took her hand from the table. Not quickly, not with any drama, just the same way he did everything that mattered, with a deliberateness that said this was decided and chosen, and not being done carelessly. His hand was warm and rough at the palm, and completely steady. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because you solve a problem, because this house has been a different place since you came into it. And I have been a different person, and I did not know until you were here how much of myself I had agreed to do without." She looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at everything she had examined carefully and found to be exactly what it presented itself as, no more and no less. And she felt something in her chest release with a quietness that was disproportionate to its outward expression, the way the end of a long tension is always quieter than you expect. "All right," she said. He held her hand for a moment longer. Then he went back to the stove because supper still needed finishing. And she sat at the table and watched him, and the kitchen was warm, and the fire was built up. And outside the window the last of the gold light lay along the grass, and the land was very quiet, in the particular way it was quiet when the wind rested. They ate supper together in the easy silence of people who have said what needed to be said, and do not need to fill the space afterward. Later, when the dishes were cleared, Boone brought out the old ledger he kept the ranch accounts in, and they sat together at the table and went through what needed to be filed with the circuit court in the morning, the documentation Wren had prepared alongside Marin's written account, which he had brought back from the settlement in a sealed envelope that now lay open between them. They worked with the particular efficiency of two people who had learned each other's working rhythms, knowing when to speak and when to let the other think. And by the time Ida came in from her neighbor's house, tired and quieter than usual, everything was organized and ready. Ida looked at the two of them at the table, at the papers between them, and the coffee gone cold, and the specific quality of the room. And she said nothing at all. She simply put her hand briefly on Wren's shoulder as she passed the lightest touch and went to hang up her coat, and the small warmth of it stayed with Wren for a long time after. Silas Price did not return to Greystone. He sent a representative, a younger man with careful manners and a nervous quality that suggested he had been told enough about the situation to be uncomfortable with his part in it. The representative brought the documents Boone had named the three, signed in the difficult years, properly voided, now the seals broken in the right places, and the correct notations made in margins. He also brought in a separate envelope, a brief letter from Silas himself. 3 sentences long, professionally courteous, the kind of letter that said nothing directly and confirmed everything by what it declined to say. He wished Boone well. He noted that the property records had been updated. He made no mention of water rights. Boone read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and pushed it away from him in the specific way of someone closing a chapter that had cost them more than they intended to spend on it. "It's done," he said. Wren looked at him. Not entirely. He looked at her. "The documentation is filed," she said. "Marin's account is on record, but Price still holds his position, and he is still himself, and the capacity to do this again exists as long as that's true." She paused. "What I filed doesn't remove him. It constrains him. And constraint is not the same as consequence." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. But it is what we have." He was quiet for a moment. "It's more than anyone has had on him before." "Yes." She looked at the voided documents on the table. "And he knows we have it. And he knows that we know how to use it." She met Boone's eyes. "Men like that calculate. We've changed the calculation. That's real, even if it isn't everything." He held her gaze for a moment, and something moved through his expression, complex and unresolved, the long grief of something not fully answered, and the harder, cleaner knowledge that full answers were sometimes not the thing the world offered, and that working with what existed was its own form of integrity. "Yes," he said, "it is." The ceremony was small, which suited them both. Maren Holst came up from the settlement and brought with her a minister who owed her a considerable number of favors and was cheerful about the circumstances. Cobb put on his good shirt and stood near the fireplace with the expression of a man attending something that confirmed his view of things, which was that events generally worked out the way they were supposed to if you gave them enough time. Ida wore her blue dress and did not cry, which was a decision she had clearly made in advance and maintained through some effort. Silas Price was the presiding magistrate for the territory, the only authority with the standing to officially confirm such arrangements. The law required his signature or his designated representatives, and he was, as he always was, perfectly cordial about it. He sent the younger representative again, who performed his function with careful neutrality, and left without staying for the meal that followed. The meal that followed was long and easy and full of the kind of conversation that happens when people who know each other well are gathered in a warm place with enough food and no particular urgency. Maren told stories about the early days of the settlement that left Cobb snorting with laughter, and Ida shaking her head with the fondness of someone who knows exactly how much of a particular story is true. Boone listened more than he spoke, as he always did, but with a quality of listening that was different from the listening Wren had observed in the early weeks, less watchful, less like a man attending to his own perimeter, more like someone who had remembered that being in a room with people was not inherently a thing to be managed. Wren sat beside him and watched the room and felt something she recognized after a moment as a specific variety of contentment she had not experienced in some time, the kind that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of something that makes the difficulty worth the cost. Later, after Maren had gone back to the settlement and Cobb had returned to the bunkhouse with the unhurried dignity of a man satisfied with his evening, Ida washed the dishes with the complete authority of someone who was not going to be argued with about it, and Boone and Wren went out to the porch. The night was cold and clear, the kind of clear that only happened after weather had moved through and taken everything cloudy with it, leaving the sky swept clean and dense with stars. The land lay open in every direction, the grass pale in the starlight, the tree line at the eastern edge dark and still. The air had the cold, clean smell of a season, turning the particular quality of a night that knows winter is coming and is not troubled by it. They stood at the porch rail and did not say much for a while, because the night did not require anything said into it, and neither did they. "Maren asked me something today," Boone said eventually. "Before the ceremony, she asked if I was certain." Wren looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd been certain for some time, that the ceremony was catching up to the fact." He paused. "She said that was the right order for it." Wren looked back out at the land. "She's right." A silence, the kind that was warm despite the cold. "I want to tell you something," Wren said. "I want to tell you what it was that made me sure. The actual moment, if there was one." He turned slightly toward her, not facing her fully, just enough to indicate he was listening. "It was the window," she said. "The gap in the window frame in the room upstairs. I came up one evening, and it had been packed with new caulking while I was out. You didn't mention it. You weren't going to mention it." She paused. It was such a small thing. So small it would have been easy to miss. But it meant you had noticed I was cold, And you had done something about it, and you had done it quietly, without needing me to know you'd done it." She was quiet for a moment. "I have spent most of my adult life in the company of people who required an audience for their good acts. I didn't know until that evening how much that had cost me." He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that she thought he might not respond, which would have been all right. But then he said, "The morning after the storm, when you came in from the yard soaked through and didn't complain about it, you just went to the stove and started warming your hands." He paused. "I thought right then, I thought, this is a person." He stopped. "I don't know if that sounds like what I mean." "It sounds exactly like what you mean," she said. He turned his head and looked at her, and in the starlight, his face was open and tired and honest in all the ways it had learned to be honest over these weeks. And she looked back at him with the same directness she brought to everything she found worth looking at properly. He reached over and took her hand on the rail the same way he had in the kitchen, the same warmth and steadiness. And they stood like that in the cold, clear night with the land spread out before them, and she felt the particular quality of a thing that had been built rather than found assembled piece by careful piece from the material of honest days. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty, because nothing real was ever without difficulty, and Wren had long since stopped expecting otherwise. The legal documentation required follow-up, and there were 2 separate occasions when messages from Silas's office arrived with language that required careful response. Each time, Boone and Wren sat at the kitchen table together and worked through it with the efficiency they had developed, and each time the response they sent was precise and clear and backed by everything they had filed. And each time the reply that came back was quieter than the one before. Constraint, not consequence, but real. Cobb returned to full work with a stubbornness that Wren had anticipated, and a careful attention to the limits she had set that surprised her, until she understood that his compliance was its own form of respect. The respect of a man who had been genuinely ill and knew it, and was not willing to risk that again. He brought her a carved figure one afternoon, small and plain. A horse in a posture of rest made from a piece of cottonwood he'd had for years. He handed it to her without ceremony and went back to work, and she set it on the workbench beside the 3 bottles she had kept as part of the documentation, and looked at both for a moment and thought about the difference between evidence of harm and evidence of care, and how a place could hold both and become something larger than either. She reorganized the back room completely in the 2nd month. Not because it needed reorganizing, but because it had become her room in the way that the kitchen had become her kitchen, and the land had begun to become her land, and she wanted it arranged in the way that made sense to her, which was slightly different from the way it had been arranged for years, and had nothing to do with that being better, and everything to do with it being hers. Boone watched this process from the doorway one afternoon, and did not say anything about the reorganization. He asked if she needed another shelf. She said yes. He built it the following Sunday from timber left over from the barn repair, measuring twice and cutting once in the way of someone for whom precision was a form of respect, and he installed it at exactly the height she had indicated with the flat of her hand, and it fit the wall as though it had always been there. She put Cecily's notebook on it, not hidden, not displayed, simply present in a place where it could be found by someone who needed it. The knowledge in it was real and useful, and had not stopped being either of those things because of what had come after. It was there, and it was part of the room now, part of what the room knew. Boone saw it there one evening when he came to tell her supper was ready, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it, and she watched his face move through something complicated and arrive somewhere quieter. "Is that all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and then after a moment, she would have wanted it used. "I know," Wren said. "That's why it's there." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the understanding between them in that moment was the kind that does not require words, because it is made of too many of them accumulated over too long a time to be carried by any single sentence. Spring came in the way it always did in that country, not gently but decisively, a week of cold rain, and then a morning that woke warm, and the land responded with the speed of something that had been waiting, grass-greening, almost overnight. The cottonwoods along the road putting out their first soft leaves, the horses moving differently in the pasture, with more energy and less patience. The season in them, as it was in everything. Wren stood on the porch in the first warm morning and looked out at the east field, the one she knew from the notebook, the one where the ironweed came in every autumn, and where Cecily had noted the weather and the quality of the light, and the small particular things that made a day worth recording. The field was brown, still winter brown, but underneath it, the green was coming. She could see it at the edges, where the soil was better drained, the faint, impossible insistence of new growth. Boone came out with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her and handed her one without comment, and they stood on the porch in the early warmth and looked at the field and the sky above it and the land rolling away in every direction with the unstoppable seasonal purpose of a place that had been doing this long before either of them and intended to continue long after. "She wrote about this field," Wren said. "I know." She wrote that she found it harder every spring, that the coming back of things made her feel. She paused, choosing the words carefully, because they were not hers, and she wanted to carry them correctly. She wrote that the coming back of things made her feel the size of the world in a way that winter didn't. That winter was contained, but spring just kept opening up. Boone was quiet for a while. She was right about that. She was right about a great many things. He looked at her. "You've read more of it." "Some, when it seemed relevant to the work." She paused. "And some when it wasn't, when I just wanted to know her." She looked at him steadily. "I hope that's all right." He turned back to the field and held his coffee cup in both hands the way he did when he was thinking. "She would have liked being known," he said finally. "By you, particularly." He paused. "I think that's why she left it where she left it." Wren considered that. "You think she knew someone would find it?" "I think she hoped." He was quiet for a moment. "She had a way of doing that, leaving things in the hope that they be found by the right person. The preparations, the notes, the chair." He stopped. "She told me once that she thought of the ranch as a kind of letter, that everything you did to it and for it was writing something for whoever came after." Wren looked out at the east field at the edges of green coming in at the borders of the brown, and she thought about that for a long time. A letter. She thought about what it would mean to write forward into a future you could not see, to make things well and make them lasting, and trust that the making would matter to someone whose face you did not know. She thought about the shelf in the back room, and the notebook on it, and the rows of labeled jars in the kitchen, all of it a kind of language spoken into the future without knowing who would receive it or when. She thought about what she wanted to write, She thought about the room upstairs with the west window and the iron-framed bed and the back room with its new shelf and the kitchen with the rocking chair in the corner by the fire and the porch where the morning came first. She thought about Cobb and his carved horses and his recovered stubbornness and the way he called her Miss Wren with a formality that was entirely affectionate. She thought about Ida's hand on her shoulder the night of the ceremony, brief and certain. She thought about Boone at the fence line in the first light, and the coffee already on, and the precise measurements of a shelf installed at exactly the right height. She set her cup down on the porch rail and turned to look at him. "I want to start a garden," she said. "A proper one, not just the kitchen patch. I want to grow what's in those jars from seed, if I can get it, so that the knowledge in them doesn't depend on what's already there, but becomes something that renews itself." He looked at her. "And I want to learn the rest of what she knew," Wren said. "Not to replace it with something else. To continue it. To add to it." She paused. "To write the next part of it." Something in Boone's face did a very quiet thing. Not dramatic, not the breaking of a dam or the lighting of a lamp. More like the last movement of something that has been settling for a long time, finding its level going still. "The south corner by the stone wall gets the most light," he said. "It's where she grew the ironweed. The soil's already worked." "Show me," Wren said. They went down the porch steps together into the first warm morning of the season, and he showed her the south corner by the stone wall where the light came longest and the soil was dark and rich and already beginning to wake, and she crouched down and put her hand flat against it, the way she put her hand against things she was learning the nature of, and felt the specific cold warm of earth at the beginning of spring, alive with its particular intention. Above them, the sky was the deep, clean blue of a day that intended to be what it was, without apology, and the cottonwoods, along the road, moved their new leaves in the light wind, and somewhere in the east field, the green was coming in at the edges, whether anyone was watching or not. The way things that are supposed to happen have a way of happening. Patient and inevitable, indifferent to the length of the winter, and unremarkable about the spring. She dug her fingers into the soil. She would begin here.